I try and paint things as they are. But there are things which are impossible. You can't pin it down and say that is how it is. You can only suggest how it might be. It looks something like this, to the best of my ability. When I come from London to the country, I'm always amazed about the amount of foliage, the number of leaves. In the country, in this bit of country anyway, there's always something in the way. You never get a clear view. Some rather beautiful things come waving along, and if they aren't in there to start with, they get themselves in there sooner or later. The garden becomes a semi-wilderness and is only saved by the winter, which is going to come and put it all down. My house. And it's rather an exceptional house, being a hexagonal and built as a folly some time ago. All I can say is it's extremely difficult to draw. It looks easy. It looks as if you could carry the shape in your head and keep this simple geometrical shape and paint it. But somehow or other, when you come to do it, it invariably escapes. I don't know why, but for me, it has proved impossible to do a drawing or a painting that is somewhat accurate. There's not only a very remarkable house, but there are some wonderful trees. A huge sycamore, and the slightly smaller tree, which is an ash tree, and it is very beautiful. They dominate the garden. When I started to paint here, I moved around to some picturesque sites, but I gradually got to subjects which were nearer the house. It may be laziness, but I'm not sure. I'm not entirely convinced by that. This picture's really about passing into this defined space of field and lawn to the next gate, which is shut, and this gate is clearly open, and you are invited in. But you're not invited any farther than the second gate. And so you stop and perhaps look at the foliage, the compost heap, and beyond up to the left. And I do remember these hoops, which I couldn't paint until I thought, well, perhaps they're like igloos. If you can imagine something to do with where people might have lived in these little things, then it helps with trying to paint them. It's quite difficult painting the hundreds and hundreds of leaves of the grass, the nettles, and all the various plants, and how to deal with them, whether you deal with them in the mass or individually. Landscape painting has a lot to do with choice and what you're going to paint and what you're not going to paint. And then what you can paint, what you find just possible to paint, and also what's impossible to paint. And so get some either left out or abstracted in some way which the paintbrush and the person holding the other end of it can manage. I came to art at my prep school when I was 7. The man who taught art was Maurice Field, and he had just come from the Slade. And so we all went along to the art room, which was a perfectly ordinary little room. And Maurice Field said to me, here's a drawing book and a pencil. Now, go away and draw taps. When you've drawn taps, you can come back. So I went away and drew taps for some part of the afternoon. And then when I thought I'd done them, I came back and I said, I've done taps. And Maurice said, well, go along and do lights now. And so I went away and did lights. We did painting in oil paint, and as a medium we used petrol. And we would go out and try and paint what we could see. I was frightened of Picasso, and I knew that I couldn't do Picassos. And I do remember Maurice Field saying, well, there's this chap, Constable, and you might be interested in what he does, and showed me some reproductions of paintings. I wasn't really moved by them much. But I did have a good look at the landscape round the school, which was Hereford and the Malvern Hills. It was quite beautiful, but I really much preferred factories and trains, things generally that smoked or had steam coming out of them, something with a bit more go to them than these measly old trees which everyone seemed to like. When the English teacher was changed, another one came, and his name was Auden. He was a friend of Coldstream's. It was decided for Auden to have his portrait painted. So Coldstream came up to paint his portrait. I knew he was an artist from London, so I thought, here's my chance to meet the genuine thing. So I thought I'd go and watch him painting. Well, I crept quietly up and I managed to look in. They were sitting round a smallish table, Auden smoking furiously, and Bill doing something on a canvas which barely fitted into the room and these two men and the table. Well, I manoeuvred myself round so I might get a chance of seeing what this man was doing. When they caught sight of me, it was a great scene. They jumped up. I ran for it. That was my first introduction to Coldstream. Later on, I realised that he too did factories, all fairly sort of gloomy. And of course this was just what I wanted to paint, and so suddenly I realised that apparently I could be a painter and do these things that I wanted to do. I eventually left the Downs and went to Bryanston, which I suppose was another advanced school, but it didn't really touch me much except for the landscape, which was wonderful. And then I found myself getting more interested in landscape and possibly gave up drawing racing cars and tugs and things like that. Well, we are an adjunct to Saxham Hall. I often feel that we live in a pavilion, and also the hall, although very nice, is almost second to the garages and the barn down the road. And I thought it was interesting to have this balance between the hall and the industrial building, which, with its arches, has, to my way of thinking, possibly even a greater beauty than the self-conscious Palladian style of the hall. So this picture is to do with the balance between those two buildings with their different reasons for being as they are. And I suppose that severely pollarded oak tree in the middle holds the balance like a scale with the weights at either end. And you move across the painting, but it is to do with the journey across. You see, I tried to get off with Susan when she was a new student at the Slade. And you won't be surprised to hear I was unsuccessful, but not entirely. I persisted and eventually managed to get her to sit in the back of my minivan and be carted away to Pimlico when, of course, she should be attending the school. And that's how it all started. Susan was the best model I've ever had. She could sit very still for a very long time, for which I was extremely grateful. I saw Susan's arm as a brilliantly lit banana shape, and I thought, well, that's a nice thing to paint, that brilliantly illuminated arm. And so that's how this picture started. No more than that. But of course, you never know the journey you're going to take, changing ideas, and also the painting itself. The painting itself disappoints almost always and changes its identity and purpose. Although it's nice if you can keep something of the original idea in your mind. And the banana arm is something that I can remember after all these years. There is this dark divide, and you feel, well, I don't think it's entirely fanciful, that Susan, sitting there, can't get out beyond that division with her toes, getting very near the edge, but not able to get onto the nearby floor. Of course, there we were, and you had long locks.
I did.
You did, yes. Not a trace of silver.
I still called you Mr. George.
Quite right. Thank you very much.
Yes.
And I called you Miss Engledow.
Miss Engledow, you did.
I did, yes.
For about a month.
And we had a steady diet of oatmeal biscuits and 1 egg omelette.
That's right. And it was 5 years, I think, this painting, wasn't
Was it?
And my sister made my little black dress. Quite nostalgic, really, seeing it. From Morton Terrace, too.
Yes, from Morton Terrace.
It feels very like Morton Terrace, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. In our family, there was no art. The nearest we got to art with my father was drawing seagulls on seaside holidays, and they were terrible drawings. So I had to somehow impress my family that I was serious about this. And they judged art by likeness. So I then tried very hard to get likenesses, and I didn't do too badly. But I also knew that they wanted me to be a farmer and to run the farm. And I also knew that I didn't want to. Well, as I remember telling my father, you need someone to admire the farm. And although I don't think he quite saw that, he thought there was no future in farming, so he didn't really mind all that much that I was going to be one of those dandies in London messing around with paints. My mother, quite a determined lady, small. I have a feeling that was regarded as a failure. Well, there's not much of a smile on the face. I can't remember what she made of it, but it wasn't approved. Not something to be treasured. But I think that's the only time she ever sat for me. Hating it. With my father, I don't think I'd ever dared ask him. He was that sort of man.
Did he ever actually see your work?
Well, he saw some that I did at Sheepscombe.
Oh, yes, I see. But he never came to your exhibitions and things?
No.
No.
No, I don't think he would like doing that. I went to sea in the RNVR and I spent 4 years bobbing around in the sea. I ended up sailing more or less around the world, well, as far as Singapore, when, luckily for me, they dropped the atom bomb and everything came to a halt. And the extraordinary thing is we were sorry. We were sorry we couldn't go on with this voyage. Well, I did drawing pretty well every day when I was in the Navy. I did a lot of drawing in Indian ink, and some of those are now in Leeds. There's a museum in Leeds given to artistic works done during the last war. I'd never been there, but I thought they'd better go somewhere, so a few of them are there. My family's farm was in Gloucestershire, and I always reckoned that people were bad-tempered in Gloucestershire because there were too many leaves on the trees, and so the people didn't get a chance. And I thought, well, what about the east of England, which I knew nothing? I ended up in Hickbush, which is just off the river, and it's in the only parish in England that Gainsborough and Constable painted in. So I felt, well, if those two can do it here on this patch, then there's a chance for me. Well, this is a tree up the track to the house, quite a substantial oak tree. And I liked very much the bark on the tree, which was fairly deeply cut into the wood. Also, I had to consider this stuff growing between the tree and me. So I tried the tree without the twigs getting between me and the tree. And then I felt the tree wasn't so interesting. And actually these twigs helped define something of their smallness and obvious fact that they're not going to last for very long. Whereas the oak tree is going to last for a very long time and is quite stable, whereas these are quite unstable. So that's how it came about, and one had to paint all the little bits which swayed this way and that at the slightest puff of the wind. At some point I became so interested in these little pellets of colour against the dark tree that I forgot that I was really painting the oak tree. And the pellets were echoed by the light coming through the foliage of the tree on either side, and they, in turn, were taken up lower down by the light from the cornfield. Eventually, when I had to paint the tree, I very much enjoyed painting the bark, even though it may seem slightly different in character. I think it's what I wanted to paint. The tree was very well worth painting because it was a fine tree, and I knew that it was going to last very much longer than I would. And you may feel jealous of it, but you know that's how it's going to be. I don't think there's anything special about being an artist, except you just think visually. You think a lot about how things look. It's more like going out to the office than most people think. For some reason I paint in the afternoon, get the clothes on, get the paints out, set out the palette. And I do it because that's the time to do it. Yes. Because I am a friend of the cold, I'm always looking for new clothes. I have a down suit, which is now getting rather old and thin. I have some extraordinary climbing boots. I also paint in gloves now. Once upon a time I used to think that was very, very wrong, but I don't see it makes much difference really as far as the painting goes. I had two sisters, both dead now. Wilma, the eldest, who was a terror, went on to be an Oxford Don. And Betsy, my younger sister, she liked eating sweets and making macaroons. And she was a botanist. I couldn't possibly paint the older one. She was much too frightening. So this is Betsy, and it's a sad picture in a way because she died before this picture was finished. Died in rather strange circumstances, having just done some keep fit class. Sat down in the chair in the gym and died. I was thinking about the people who had posed for me, and of course one thinks about them as people with their particular shapes which are interesting. But then you sometimes think, well, they're obscuring the wall. Where they are, I can't see the wall. So perhaps the wall has part of the description of the person by being obscured. So I painted this picture by painting the wall as it bordered on the form of the head. And I tried to paint the head with the same attitude, not with that special attitude of eyes, nose, mouth, and likeness. And I just worked my way across where there was no longer any wallpaper to be seen, but areas of different colour, which of course was face, and then out the other side and see what happens. Well, I don't know that this is a picture of a still life, because I used to get on very well with Betsy, and so clearly she was more than just a bottle or a plate of fruits. What would have happened next to the picture had I got on with it? Of course, one doesn't know. It might have been at its best when it stopped here. But as I said, it stopped there for rather tragic reasons. I think all portraits are a collaboration, and in all portraits you fall in love with the model, almost always. And this isn't going to be very polite, but when you stop painting them and you meet them on the street or something, you think, how could I have liked that person so much? I'd known Susan for a long time when I did this one, and I was very interested in the fact that we can see the distances that are sideways to us, but we always misjudge the distances which are long ways on. So we fixed this pose, which was extremely uncomfortable for Susan, and having got the arm's length as a unit, that's to say from her fingertips to her shoulder, I used that length to go sideways, and I made marks on the wall. So I had the same distances that I could see. The arm's length unit also existed from the back of her head to the wall.
You can imagine it was a very painful pose to start off with. Sort of thing they do to prisoners as a torture.
The house was on the side of the road away from the station and overlooked a bare patch towards the station. Presumably a bomb had fallen there. The building we had was built after the war because it was sort of new. It had a nice flat roof. It was immensely cold, the room that we managed to inhabit. Yet in those days I was meant to be attending Camberwell, but I did, but not very wholeheartedly or for very long. It was Andrew Forge and Chris Vincent and myself to begin with, and then we were joined by Eiton. Then Miles Murphy came, and the street was the market. And that's just typical. I can't even tell you what they're selling and what they kept in that box. That's a well-known Lower Marsh scene. They're listening, obviously, to one of these cheap jack. Everyone's gathered around, and they've got crowds every day. Little crowds. That's the building site, just at the back of Lower Marsh, and that, of course, is the view from the window. That's the church. All the tops of the steeples were taken off during the early part of the war. I suppose they thought they'd be too dangerous crashing down, and it took quite a long time before they got replaced. Phew. That was cold. Yes, it all looked rather grubby and desolate. Oh, tremendous fogs. I loved them. I used to go out in the fog, get hopelessly lost. There is always a rather depressing interval between paintings when you stump around and think you're never going to paint again, and why do it, and so on. But sooner or later you find that you might as well give it another go, and you see something. And then you find you're really engaged in that, and it becomes extremely interesting. And it's the most interesting thing you've ever seen in your life, and also quite impossible to paint. Well, this picture's really about the long line of trees that stretches from end to end. And it's that line, that dark line, that tempted me to paint it. I see this view from an upstairs window in the house. The house is quite small, and of course the rooms are even smaller. And it is very difficult to arrange so that you can see the view that you like from looking out of the window and looking at the painting with sufficient illumination on the painting to see what you're doing. I believe I took the usual 7 weeks to paint this picture, and being fairly bored by the time I got to the extreme right, until I became properly engaged in painting it as a tree and became interested in it as a tree. And then, like most things, when you really look at them, they become interesting. Well, the painting got done, and you never know when it's done. You sort of wonder and snarl at it a bit, and generally think it's a bit disappointing. And I was cleaning my brushes when I thought, looking at it in that little space towards the right, that I might just put a man in. So I nipped in the man with whatever happened to be on the brush, and thought it was a silly thing to do. But there it was, and I didn't know what he was doing, except I wanted him to be walking through the landscape. And that was how it rested. And I wondered about this man and whether he had to go. When looking out of the window, there, walking from right to left, was a man. There'd never been anyone in that field before. But there he was, and what's more, he was exactly the right size for the picture. Well, that decided it. He had to stay. I use very few colours. I have counted them, and it's 7. It means the mixtures can be simple, and you can take them to their extremes, because their extremes are not very far, and you can remember more or less what the mixtures are. And if you consider the colours, you have warmer colours and cooler colours. You know where to go. So it does make it slightly easier to keep an order, which, as anyone knows who's dabbled around in oil paint, they're inclined to get very muddled up, and you end up with a soup. But then I sometimes introduce a sort of visitor, like you get in any radio program. You have the old folkies, and then you have the bright young thing that comes in just for the occasion. Everyone sings happy birthday. Well, there are those who come in, and Michael Harding's green, this very shrill green, is one of those visitors. And his tube still travels with me in the basket.
Oh, does it?
But I don't use it. I don't want to use it. Bill Coldstream took up the job of being the Slade Professor, And he co-opted Andrew Forge and myself to be on his staff. And from then on, I suppose I just went on doing a day's teaching a week. There was some rather curious title we had. We were paid remarkably little and had no status at all. But we went there, and the Slade under Coldstream at that time was a very lively place indeed. We had wonderful parties. Eventually, they all left, and his place was taken by Lawrence Gowing, and the school changed its character naturally. And I suppose I had been teaching there for some time, so it wasn't quite so exciting. And eventually he left, and there didn't seem to be anyone else to do the job, so I took it on. I felt that there was something to be taught in art school. I mean, flirting with the girls is obviously one of the things that art schools do to considerable expertise by some of the teachers, but there must be something else. I knew Freud because we had been at school together, and because he had taught at the Slade at the same time. I don't know if he ever did any teaching. He used to come into the studios and everyone would be trembling, generally caused a furore. Managed to crash his Rolls Royce just outside the gates and then walk away, leave it. And we used to gauge each other because we were somewhat of the same age, because there were stone stairs going up to the top studio. And I would meet him at the bottom to show him the way and to come and have a look at the students whom I had got a particular interest in. And so we would go tramping up these stairs about 3 stories or anyway a long way, and it was all right, but I noticed that we appeared to be getting faster and faster as we moved up, and eventually we would stop at the top. Of course, he was very fit, and I don't know whether he actually said anything, but it was clear that he was seeing how he and I were getting on and who could come up the stairs quickest. Oh, well, I knew he had won the artistic rivalry because at school we formed an oil painting club, and eventually we celebrated by having an exhibition, and then the prize was given, of course, to Lucien, who was much more sophisticated than I was. However, I did get the second prize. Well, obviously I was influenced by Engledow because we were friends, knew each other well. I had known him in some roundabout way at Camberwell, but he was a junior. We used to meet anyway. So on Thursday we would, in the evening, we would not only have a drink in his studio, but we would talk about what had happened at the Slade and what had happened during my teaching. Although he was on quite a different track to mine and very interested in relating what they were doing in the Slade to what the Renaissance artists had been doing in Florence and Verona. We were quite different. Occasionally we snarled at each other. He couldn't stand the word sketching. So I used to bait him. So the sketching was going well.
He always rose to it, didn't he?
Yes, always.
He'd turn up to supper and say, I've been sketching, and he'd practically throw you out because he couldn't bear it.
Putting people into landscapes is something which has been done for years and years. And who could be better for the job of posing than Susan? So we made a few experiments as to where she could stand and where I couldn't be. But of course Susan couldn't always be there. So I devised a fake Susan out of a piece of a branch. I took careful measurements And I remember painting the top of the branch white to give me some idea of how her hair would appear amongst the greens. And so there she is, almost swamped by the landscape, not quite taking charge of it, although once you've focused on her, you find it difficult for her not to become the centre point of interest. But until you've actually found the figure, then the landscape swirls around and is itself the importance of the picture. I try and paint what's there. I'm only really interested in painting how it looks now. If I have to make it up, I find that rather boring. So it's a product of repeatedly putting down a moment, even though the moment may be spread over 7 weeks of afternoons, as far as the weather goes. If the weather changes, well then, so does the painting. You imagine it's very different, but when I finish painting, the whole lot looks pretty well the same. But because it's a collection of small observations, there isn't a whole scene of a dull day, a fine day, or any particular sort of day. Rather occasionally, for one reason or another, I paint indoors, and in this case in the conservatory, which has a good deal of light, and the things look very well in it. Usually we have wood fires in the evening, and sometime during the day we go out and collect sticks. And I very much like sticks. I think they're amazing things, and sometimes they're more surprising than others. And this picture and this piece of stick in it, I thought was extraordinarily beautiful, with its gesture of outwardness, I suppose, almost reminding you of a bowl holding space. These fruits, these are not fruits. These are the ends of logs piled up on the shelf against which the stick is resting. If you see them as apples, or perhaps rather pale oranges, then it doesn't matter. But it is really all sticks, and I hope to try and get some of my enthusiasm for them into the picture, so that you too, the spectator, travels up the sticks like an ant and passes these various things on the way. Oil paint's quite expensive, so painting thinly is an economical way of painting. Secondly, if you make a mistake, which I would always do, you can rub it out with a Terpsy rag. And also you could feel for the canvas, you could feel for the ground, the white ground. And the white ground can seem the most important thing you've got, because from the white ground comes all the light. And what you're doing is you're taking the light away. So if you can preserve as much of the light as possible, then your picture may have some of that light in it captured. And I now paint much thicker than I used to. And I like paintings because they're there. Unlike music, which poor music fades away, painting is there. And I go to the National Gallery for comfort, partly, to see these old friends. Pictures are, in their nature, abstract because they're flat and they're not a bit like leaves and twigs and things, or sky, or wet fields. They are a language that tells you about them. It's quite interesting how some things you like painting and some things you really don't like painting. But it's true that sometimes it's the things you didn't like painting and that prove very dreary to paint. At the end of it, come out rather better than those things you felt sure about. It do actually just crosses your mind that you're now fairly ancient and you've been painting since you were 7. And why aren't you any better? At painting, I don't think you do get better. You have to be on your guard or you'll get worse. There's no doubt, and it's very tedious sometimes. I'm still trying to get a likeness, and it's going to take me more than my life, I suppose. I've been amazingly lucky. I would never advise anyone to take up art as a career, but how I've managed, extraordinary. Still here. Well, I never really think what other people make of the pictures, and sometimes I think the whole lot of rubbish, and then sometimes I rather like bits of them, and, well, I'm not very sorry to see them go, but I miss them then.